Greetings, everybody. Hello, good evening. How are you? I hope you're well. My name is Gareth. I'm your friendly host for tonight, Gareth Mitchell. I'm one of the science presenters at BBC Radio and also at Imperial College. I'm one of the lecturers on the Science Communication MSc course, and it's my job to keep everybody entertained today, keep everything on track for this really important discussion about our response to COVID-19 and how much it provides hope for the natural world for the future. So we're all flying less, we're travelling less, we're shopping more locally. In general, many of us have just become nicer people. So I suppose the question is, how sustainable is that? And also, what lessons can we learn from our response to this crisis? And how can we apply those lessons to other really big, important global issues? Obviously, like the climate crisis and indeed human destruction of natural habitats and so much more. A lot to get into tonight. We're going to do that with your help and also that of three fabulous experts. So we have a climate scientist, we have a behavioural scientist, and we have an expert, a campaigner, a well-known, well-renowned campaigner on all things related to the environment. We're going to meet them really, really quickly. We're going to meet them soon. And we're going to hear your questions. But just to give you a quick bit of background, this is part of our online Lates series. So basically, at the end of every month between now and the end of the year, we're going to be bringing you a week of events, online events, focused on research from Imperial College. So it's a celebration of Imperial research, but also an opportunity for us all to get together in these days, in these lockdown or relatively lockdown days, to discuss really important issues in science, technology, medicine and the environment that affect us all. So this event is on YouTube, as you can see, and as we go along, we want you to post your questions. So put them in the comments, and we have a team of fabulous moderators who will then send me the best of your questions. They'll appear on the dashboard in front of me, and I can put those questions to the experts. And the session is being recorded, so you can go back and play it later, or what we'd love you to do is share it with your friends, those who couldn't be here for the live event. Send them a link to this so they can watch it in their own time. So that's basically how it's all going to go, and I hope you enjoy the event. So let's get straight in and meet our panelists. First of all, we have Marina Mills, who's Senior Lecturer in Environmental Social Science at Imperial Centre for Environmental Policy. And Marina, you apply social science to challenges associated with biodiversity and conservation. So from what you've seen over these last few months, is there any hope? Are you hopeful?
Well, yeah, I think the response has definitely provided me with some hope. So I think it was wonderful that we all kind of gathered and changed our behavior for a cause that was bigger than ourselves. Also, seeing people were self-isolating, I guess, even though they didn't know the people who were being impacted necessarily by their actions, and I thought that was wonderful, which showed that people actually care. We also showed that if we act quickly, that we can act quickly, and if we care enough about the problem. So I think that was wonderful to have as well. So some hope, but obviously there were also lots of issues.
Okay, yeah. So you'll give humankind maybe 9 out of 10 for effort for now, but we'll just see,
maybe 8.
See if the good behaviour. Maybe 8. Okay. So we'll see how that behaviour develops, obviously, during as this crisis continues, and let's hope that some of the good behaviour can be sustained. But I wonder if Yuri has such high hopes for humanity. This is Yuri Rogel, lecturer in climate change and the environment. He's at the Grantham Institute at Imperial, and Yuri, commenting on this brief reduction in carbon emissions at the height of the global lockdown. You said this, you said, none of this is good news for anyone. For the climate, this month-long wake in otherwise record high emissions is entirely insignificant. So that implies, Yuri, that you're maybe a bit less hopeful than Marina was.
Yeah, that's right. Well, hope is about the future, and I think that was more a comment about the present. I think looking at it from the present, yes, I think the COVID pandemic is still a tragedy, and hope is really just looking at it's just depending on how we look towards the future. And towards the future, I mean, I think we can see indeed that when awareness and the urgency is clear, we can really act rapidly and drastically, and we saw that during the pandemic. And also governments are willing to listen to scientific input and take that into account in the measures that they put in place. And that is really, really hopeful, because that is really important also if you want to tackle the climate change problem. At the same time, I mean, I see important reasons for concern. The unequally distributed impacts of the pandemic for some people of society, this was quite convenient. For others, this was a real tragedy, a real social tragedy. And then, of course, I come back to what it means for climate action. COVID lockdowns really do nothing for climate action. And this is really a misunderstanding often of what lockdown mean for climate change. In a way, lockdowns are really the opposite of what we need for tackling climate change. So what we saw now is a good experiment, but what we need to tackle climate change is very different.
Yeah, and something much more sustained, I'm sure. Well, let's see what Judy Ling Wong thinks. Judy is honorary president of the Black Environmental Network and is known worldwide as a pioneer in the field of ethnic participation in the built and natural environment. It's been awarded an OBE for her pioneering work. Really good to have you on the panel there, Judy. And how about you? Hopeful or not hopeful?
I am hopeful. I think that historically, there are always particular moments of opportunity for tremendous change in society. And I think this is a moment that challenges us to transform ourselves and society. And I think that some of the basic building blocks have been coming forward as a result of, for example, what I call the enforced retreat into isolation, where most of our life activities have fallen away. And suddenly a lot of people have discovered that we can cope with doing without many material pastimes, that we can cope with seeing our economic, health, and social systems partially dismantled. And this kind of experience means that we have a new confidence in the potential for massive change. You know, before this, we all think, oh, you know, society, absolutely impossible. We can't change massively, but we are coping. So we have a new strength. And the other thing is that several big things have been thrown at us. Of course, there's COVID and a completely different way of living, but there's also climate change is constantly there. And then Black Lives Matter, which is about equality and diversity. And one of the experiences I feel that's really important is that the middle classes have been forced to live like the working class without all the extras, no theater, no eating out all the time, no massive entertainment that's very expensive and so on. Some of my middle class friends say to me, my God, you know, look at my bank account and there's all this money piling up. I never realized I had so much spare money if I didn't spend like I normally do. And this sort of opens a window into change because, you know, politicians are really, really frightened of losing votes, raising taxes and so on. But now the middle and upper classes are finding that they're discovering the essentials of life, where the most important things in life are about people, the family, their community and so on. And I think that as a result of this experience of privilege and deprivation, they will be more ready to give some of that up and share with others. And perhaps we will get those massive societal changes in which we share more.
Okay, so that gets us off to a great start. Now, remember, folks, those of you watching this, if you're watching it live, then we really want you to send in your questions. I'm sure you are already. Just put them in the comments here on the YouTube video. The moderators will send the best ones through to me, and I can put them to the panelists. And so we're going to have a little chit chat with the panelists first. That gives us enough time to collate a few questions. But within the next few minutes, we're really switching this over to you, dear viewers, with your questions and concerns. Now, Judy, as you were talking there and you were saying the middle classes in a way have had to live more like people in lower classes, but really, you know, the middle classes are the ones who have nice broadband connections. They have the kinds of jobs where they can work at home. They have nice big gardens that they can sit in when they can't go off to their pied-à-terre in Marbella or wherever it might be. Have the middle classes really had a better lockdown than the less well off?
Of course it is better. Everything is relative, but relative to their own lives, the impact is huge. You know, all the things they've taken for granted they can do, they cannot do. I mean, they tell me they are like, living like they're in prisons. They are living without all the things that they took for granted and so on. And I think they really have had, in a relative sense, a taste of doing without. And they hoped, I think this is the important point I'm trying to make, that massive changes, and of course with the other things like Black Lives Matter and so on, and bringing forward that emotion in society of a wish to change that is now within so many people is a hopeful thing.
Right, okay. I'm sure Yuri's going to have a few words to say on that. But just before I come back to you, Yuri, I think, Morena, I'm very interested in the behavioural side of things here. And of course, we have seen some great behaviour, more people walking, more people cycling, fewer people going in their cars, many fewer people going out on aircraft. But then in many ways, a lot of the airlines have been closed down and they've been cancelling flights. So even if you want to fly somewhere, you can't. And as we've seen now with this quarantine that's come in for visitors returning from Spain, that's putting a whole big block on flying. I suppose what I'm fishing around for here is that a lot of this change in behaviour has coincided with some really good weather here in the Northern Hemisphere, or specifically here in the UK. I wonder if people would have behaved so well when it was a bit too cold, if this was in November and it was rather too cold and wet to go out on your bicycle or go walking a little bit more to the local shop. So where's the behaviour in all this?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I think that's a really good something that needs to get the government thinking about how they should sustain these behaviors that are environmentally friendly, that are more sustainable, because people really will only sustain those behaviors that they see as relatively easy to do. They're behaviors that are relatively advantageous for them in some way, whether it's pleasurable or it's or maybe they feel healthier by cycling to work or walking to work, and they realize that it's really nice. But when it starts raining, if these behaviors aren't pleasurable anymore, they might stop doing them. So the government really should be doing everything that they can to actually make sure that these behaviors are as pleasurable as possible. So thinking about how should what they can invest in to promote these behaviors.
Right. OK. So, Yuri, what about your thoughts? And you mentioned in your introductory comments that the pandemic has affected worse off people more than better off people, as I suppose you might expect. So can you expand that for us, and therefore what we should take away from this, these inequalities and their response to the pandemic, and what that has to tell us about facing up to issues around the natural world?
Yeah, I see a strong link here also with climate change impacts, and how climate change impacts society very differently. And it is always the less well off, the less that are most vulnerable and that are impacted more directly and more strongly by, for example, climate change extreme events, and also in this case by this socioeconomic hardship. Now, if you look at the statistics, and if statistics are presented in a certain way, then this suffering even doesn't show up, because in terms of GDP, in terms of dollars, in terms of pounds or euros, these populations represent a small portion of the entire economy. But in terms of people, in terms of lives affected, these people play a disproportionate role, and they are disproportionately affected. And this is true both for climate impact as well as their role and their vulnerability in any long-term climate transition where we want to reach a zero carbon society. It are often these populations that have challenges changing jobs, finding jobs, reschooling themselves, and so on. And so also there, I think there is a clear parallel between those that suffer and those that can deal quite well and can actually benefit.
Yeah, and it's maybe those who are less well off and who suffer more, who are the more disenfranchised, the ones who don't show up in the data, the ones we don't hear as much, who don't get invited to be on the TV or whatever it might be. These are maybe a silent, possibly minority, maybe even a majority, who just don't have a voice. I just want to remind our viewers, thank you so much for joining us on this stream, by the way, folks. We're really glad to have you all here on YouTube, and I really do want you to be part of this discussion. So quick reminder, if you've got questions, and we want questions more than comments, then just post them in the comments and the best ones will filter their way through to me. And a quick reminder that the discussion, we're not talking about vaccines. In fact, we're doing that next time. So we're not here to talk about the vaccine, but we are here to talk about our response to this coronavirus, about how it's affected our attitude to the environment, how we've seen maybe environmentally better behaviour since lockdown, because basically we can't do so much or spend as much as we might have done before, and really asking how sustainable this is and how it's going to help us with other big crises, like the biggest of all, the climate crisis. So I can already see a few comments coming up on my panel here and questions, so we're going to go to those very soon. But just as we build up a few more of those, gives me a bit more choice about what to put to our panel. I want to put this to all three of you before we go to the audience. And when we make comparisons between this coronavirus pandemic and our response to it, and also climate change and our response to that, and I think we were all really struck at the beginning of this crisis, kind of seems like a long time ago, you know, back at the end of March, beginning of April, when our Prime Minister told us, stay home, don't go out, do as you're told. And so many people did. I think we were all quite surprised, maybe delighted at how people followed that advice. And that in many ways augured very well for, well, you know, if we're given other advice or guidance about mitigating climate change and behaving well in terms of our relationships to the planet, maybe that's really encouraging. But I'm going to come to you, Judy, first with this one, and we'll see what Yuri and Marina have to say as well. I just wonder if the big difference is that with this pandemic, we saw the threat right in front of us. You know, there was a time that we could see our loved ones, for instance, either becoming ill, or we were desperately worried about, especially older relatives. The stock market was crashing. The Prime Minister was in hospital. This was real. So, of course, we did what we were told. But I'm going to put it to you, Judy, that when people tell us that the Arctic ice sheet is melting, that seems very different. It's a related crisis. But how do we harness the behaviour that we've seen relating to this pandemic and bring that to that, I suppose, longer term, but still very pressing issue around the climate crisis?
I think that there are several things happening because of COVID and because of Black Lives Matter that's been highlighting huge aspects of climate change. I mean, as highlighted how we're all going to be affected in terms of something very basic, our food security. As the climate actually rises in temperature and so on, the harvest will decrease, and this will threaten all of us, not just in the UK, but right across the world. And this has a lot to do also with diversity, inequality, how people are affected. And I think some of the things that we've been made aware of through the COVID experience is this inequality that's come so close to us. Some of our most essential workers, we've been shown, are the people bearing the brunt of it, Black and ethnic minorities and so on. And they're poorly paid. We're paying the most essential people peanuts for what they do. You know, so we are adjusting our vision of what to do. And part of the whole climate change issue is how do we actually work with climate change itself in a way that makes life better for everybody. I've been actually challenging institutions like the Center for Alternative Technology with their report on net zero and so on. I asked them, you know, with net zero, trying to bring emissions down, behavior change, bicycling, using public transport and all that, do people give account to inequality in the sense that so many people have such a low level of living in terms of standard that even for them to have an acceptable level of living, they actually need to emit more? So in that equation of net zero, we actually have to have this equality and diversity dimension. And this is where I think these things are bringing forward what essential workers are doing for us, how the other half is living, how the middle classes and richer people can do without, and come back to those vision they have become aware of as a result of isolation.
Right.
That the essential things in life are actually family and people.
Yeah, and of course, many people have reflected on that. They've just valued their family and their loved ones so much more. Okay, so an argument there that to bring the less well off out of poverty, their emissions, their carbon emissions are going to increase, and they're entitled for them to increase in the same way that we've enjoyed the opportunity to spend and travel in this way. But I think what you're saying, in order to compensate for that, the better off people just need to do less environmentally damaging stuff. In other words, really shrinking inequalities. Now, I've had a question, and I'm going to come to you, Morena, with this one, because it's about behaviour. Liz Danner asks, what behaviour changes have you seen so far that are good for the environment, and has an increase in shopping locally helped at all? That's from Liz. What do you say, Marina?
So behaviors that are good for the environment, I guess less commuting is good for the environment. People actually spending more time in the local green spaces, and then therefore increasing their connection to nature is also in a way good for the environment, because if they feel more connected to nature, they're more likely to protect it. And if local shopping helps, I think, I guess, yeah. So if you can keep your footprint as local as possible, it's great. Now, the relative impact of that versus, I guess, some other actions that you could take, such as, I don't know, changing the type of electricity that you're like changing to renewables in your house, then I guess, you know, it's more important that you switch to renewables. But I guess it's all about relative, and there's a lot of things that we can engage in, and potentially even take this COVID time to reflect on all the different behaviors that we could engage in that will have an impact to reduce our carbon footprint and our impact on the natural world.
Yeah, okay, so there you go. And many people saying, well, we're going to have a staycation this year. We'll save some money. We'll save a bit of carbon. And, you know, it's perfectly nice. We live in a beautiful country. Why do we need to keep jumping on aircraft all the time and increasing our carbon emissions? But I can almost feel Yuri wanting to get back in here and say, yeah, but people shopping more locally. Of course, that's a great thing, isn't it, Yuri? But presumably you'd say it's just not enough. It's a drop in the ocean, especially when our consumer patterns go back to just the way they were before, when this is finally blown through.
Yes and no. I think what we see now shows that people can change a lot, and they can and it can have a big impact. The question, or one observation first, is that even with these massive changes, we have basically swept our streets clean of cars. We are almost taking no flights, or we did that for a couple of months. Even with that, the emission reductions were only a couple of 10%. To halt climate change, we need to bring emissions down to zero. So what that means is that behavioral change is part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. That really means that it needs to be complemented, or actually supported, by a much more structural drive, a long-term drive of transformation of the society. We've seen emissions of transport, of the cars and of burning petrol go down, but we have seen the emissions linked to the energy that we use in our houses go up, because of course we are at home, we use more energy. We cannot decide from one day to the other that we don't want to use any fossil fuel anymore in our energy. So for that, we need government policies that over the long term make that possibility available to us.
Yeah, and of course we have seen some government action on this, haven't we? So, you know, Boris Johnson's come up with this plan to give people incentives to use more solar energy, or to improving the insulation in their homes, these quite generous grants. And clearly part of regenerating the economy during the post-pandemic austerity and slowdown that is going to happen. So we want to create more jobs, more incentives, more economic activity. So one way we do that is triggering people to put better insulation into their homes, and that will create jobs. And I think I'm right in saying that in France, Macron has said to the airlines in France, well, if you want any state help after this pandemic, well, you've got to fill in your side of the bargain and save a whole load of carbon on your fleet. Otherwise, we're not helping you. So it just seems, Yuri, that there are opportunities here for governments to invoke policies that both regenerate economies and generate jobs that we much needed after all this, but also that do so in a way that's good for the environment.
Absolutely. Again, all this starts from a quite dire place, and that is a huge recession, one that we have not seen in the last century, and where governments now are trying to pick up. But it's encouraging to see that basically money is not a problem. I mean, government spending is really through the roof. So the question is really how that money is spent, and it makes absolute sense, and it's the only thing that makes sense, particularly in the UK with a net zero target already in place, to put this money, to make this money contribute to a long-term transformation. And home insulation is excellent here. Also having green strings to bailouts for airplanes makes sense. Ultimately, it is really also making sure that from this crisis, we keep the desirable aspects, and we make sure that we create a desirable future. Lots of the actions that people have had to take over the past couple of months, not all of them are desirable. Okay, some we like the connection, the better connection with nature. We like the better connection with family, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that some of our families live maybe not in this country. What about people that were disconnected from their families for a couple of months while their family members were suffering? So these are undesirable situations that we want to avoid, but we still want to enable them in a long-term and a sustainable future that is desirable to all.
Okay, that's great. And we're getting questions coming in on my panel here. This is brilliant, folks. Keep it up. Those of you watching the live stream, we're with you for another half an hour. So don't hang about. Get your questions in. Just a reminder, we're not talking about vaccines or conspiracy theories here, but we are asking what we can all do to hopefully sustain some good environmental practice, to pass hopefully a better and cleaner environment down to our children and our grandchildren. You must have loads of questions on that, like what am I meant to do? Will insulating my house help? What about carbon taxes? Lots of things that I'm sure you can get into. Ask us about cycling or cycle routes or best practice that we've seen from other countries. Anything like that. We really want to get your views. So I'm going to, and your questions, most importantly. We kind of want your views, but most of all, we want your questions because we've got plenty of views from our panel. And I'm going to put this to Judy, who, as we know, like us all, cares about inequality, bringing the less well off out of poverty. Now I'm going to put it to you as a devil's advocate, Judy, that the one sure hellfire way of doing that is to get the travel industry up and running. Think of all those jobs. Think of all the people on lower incomes who rely on jobs in the catering and entertainment and hospitality industry. If we can get those air routes flying again, third runway at Heathrow, jobs in the airlines, tourists flocking to the hotels so that less well off people can be there in the service economy looking after them, that's how we bring people out of poverty, isn't it?
That's just about money, isn't it? I mean,
well, it's no bad thing if it pulls people out of poverty and shrinks inequalities.
There are other ways of making money. There are much more green jobs. Tourism can be ecotourism, for example, and tourism can be increased locally instead of globally. I think all this thing about interconnectedness of the world is really important at this point. For example, just now you were talking about local shopping and so on. You mustn't forget that 80% of our food is imported. The shopping might be local, but the food isn't. So our relationship to the world and how we run our trading relationships is really important. For example, one of the ways of including wealth being shared across the world is to pay more for the goods and the food we get from the rest of the world. Now, I have never understood why if a meal here costs 25 pounds, I go to another country, which is so-called the developing world, I sit down, I eat the same meal, and it's only 5 pounds. I mean, what is that?
Yeah.
You know, we are not sharing and recognizing the work and the production and what it means to us in an equal way. And I think that we can profit from an interconnected world because we're really interdependent on each other. And when it comes to the crunch point, if we really had to cope with climate change and less harvest and so on, we need the goodwill of all those countries that are growing our food for us.
Yeah, okay. And actually, just my devil's advocate question, just open up the airlines, get people flocking to the beaches, create jobs in the hospitality sector. I suppose the flip side to that is, and maybe a glimmer of hope, that governments like our own, a Conservative government, that it's not their usual temperament to want to control the economy too much. Very much the idea would be to leave things open to market forces. And yet, we are seeing direct intervention, the Treasury pumping loads of money into the economy through incentives and tax breaks or whatever they may be, or possibly increasing taxes. And it seemed to me that the shining hope for dealing with climate change was the Paris Accord, which involved governments, which involved direct action, not just market forces, to engineer better environmental stewardship through all kinds of things. So I suppose it's a long way of asking you, Judy, if you see some hope here that maybe governments, even the right-leaning, more market forces leaning governments, have got the bug now for a bit of hands-on control of their economies, for raising taxes if they have to, and this might actually play rather well into a longer-term political and economic fix for environmental issues.
I think when it comes to a crunch point, the people of this country really are actually fundamentally behind equality and behind everyone having an acceptable living standard and so on. And you've seen, interestingly, in this crunch point of COVID happening and lots of jobs collapsing and so on, you have this government, its policies are more like a socialist government. It is taking care of people. And it's borrowing massive amounts of money from the future. I've always been told austerity, and all this sort of stuff. Suddenly people say, oh my God, where's all this money coming from? So they can do things. The money side can be manipulated for the good of people. And a lot of people want this to continue, that everyone is protected. Okay, if there's more, let's have people being richer than others and so on, because they do more, they're more creative or whatever. But there's a fundamental baseline.
Okay, there you go. So when they want to, they can find the money tree, can't they? So why not get all this public spending for good things and hopefully environmentally good things as well? Right, so we've got another question. So folks, we need your questions. It's getting urgent now. We've only got about another 20 minutes to go. So just get typing in that comment section your questions. Like we were talking about tax there. If you've got any questions about, well, I'll just throw it out to you as a question. Leave us a comment on this if you want. If I said to you, okay, you've got to pay 3% more income tax to support environmental schemes, to support schemes to shrink inequalities on the back of this pandemic. Think of all those really less well-off people who have not been able to work from home, for whom the furlough scheme is going to run out fairly soon, who face a dire future. Are you prepared to support them through higher taxes? Maybe you are one of those people who's really feeling badly off at the moment and you wish that you had the luxury of being able to earn your full salary whilst being able to work from home. Anything you've got to say about that, let us know. So, okay. Some of the questions that are coming in now are about the before and the after, like this one. Really good question. Following the opinion that the behaviour of the public as we emerge from this is more important than the behaviour during the lockdown, how are we doing so far? So, okay, people behaved pretty well during the lockdown, but I think this question is implying with people flocking to beaches and maybe ditching social distancing in their hurry to get back to the pub, maybe it's not going so well. This is definitely a question for you, Morena. What about the behaviour that we're seeing, and what behaviour should we see after the lockdown as we begin to emerge from all this?
Well, I guess the correct behavior people already know, but what I think is what I think the change in behavior really shows the importance of the leadership by those who are actually championing the cause, right? So people are more likely to restrict their activities for the benefit of the whole if they actually believe that other people are restricting their activities as well. If they see other people cheating, they're more likely to cheat too. So trusting each other and trusting leadership is really critical, and that's going to be critical also with the climate change, with combating the climate change crisis. And I think the other thing is it's just really clear messages, right? So the like policies which potentially support the preferred action, as we were talking before, like the government really needs to kind of take charge and help us through this towards sustainability, right? It's not something that people will just be able to do by themselves. And I think especially with if you have different bits of information coming at you and you really don't know what to trust, and they're suggesting different things, and the case of the masks was like a really good example of this, right? So lots of people were talking about different types of masks and when you should wear it and where you should wear it, and until the government provided a really clear policy, everybody should wear masks inside shops. That's basically a really clear message, and at least around my neighborhood, everyone's doing it. So I think these clear messages and clear signals to the public are critical, and at the moment, or for a while there, they were lacking. And there's it's kind of obvious why people kind of gave up on a lot of the actions that they were doing.
Yeah, because maybe they felt that our leaders, their hearts weren't necessarily in it. So why should all of us lot care, I suppose, might have been the attitude. Yeah. Okay, I'll tell you what,
exactly.
let's go to Judy with this one. I wonder if you can talk to me about cycling routes, because we've had a few questions about that, which is, what is Imperial doing, if anything, Judy, to lobby, for instance, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster councils to improve cycling routes? I don't know if you work directly on that, but where does, for instance, cycling, and where do cycling routes come into the mix here?
Yeah, unfortunately, I know we are situated in South Kensington, but unfortunately, I don't know what Imperial does on lobbying the local council in improving that. I know that many of our colleagues already just come on a daily basis to the office by bike, and I know that cycling routes can be vastly improved. But otherwise, unfortunately, I cannot really give more substantive. Maybe Marina knows.
Fair enough. Yeah, well, let's come back to you with that, Marina, because I know you're obviously, given what you research, you're very interested in cycling and lots of other sort of good environmental behaviours.
Yeah, so I guess Imperial does have a sustainability champion, and there are sustainability committees within different departments that kind of are increasingly wanting to lobby different councils, right, or the Westminster Council. I think so the government is, and there's lots of different councils that have been acting to improve cycling routes. However, it's really important, the quality again of these cycling routes, and the quality of the cycling experience is really important, because it's not necessarily just increasing the number of cycling routes or like drawing a line on the road. People need to feel safe, right? So for example, a personal experience, for me to drive to work, I live in Hackney and I have to go to South Kensington. There are some bits of this, cycle, but there's lots of bits of the cycling route which I don't necessarily feel that safe. I still do it, but there's lots of things that can be improved, and they should be improved thinking about the long term and thinking about the cycling experience. It's not just about adding lines on the road.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to go to Judy with a question in a minute, but just on that point about cycling and indeed walking, one thing that strikes me is kind of maybe not techno fixes as such, but there are apps that give good walking routes, and I'm sure cycling routes that take you away from the main routes as now traffic sadly gets busier on our roads. And I do a show at the BBC every Tuesday. I live in South London, and every Tuesday, because I don't want to go on public transport and I'm not really into cycling, I walk. It takes me 2 hours to walk from South London to Broadcasting House. I go into the BBC, read out a few links and record a few bits and pieces, and then walk all the way back home again. 4 hours walking. You get through loads of audio books. You've got some nice walking routes on the phone that take you through some interesting back streets that you didn't know before. And it does mean, as you can tell from the tone of my voice, Judy, it's making me sound very virtuous that I walk, and it's a nice low carbon way of going about it. But Judy, the question I've got from you actually comes from Yang Ji Cheng. Is this lovely question? What does it mean to truly connect to nature? Oh, are you on mute? We're not getting anything from Judy's. Oh, Judy, come back.
Yes, I'm back. To truly connect to nature, you have to have access to nature. And this has been a huge question within especially the urban areas where the poorer communities don't have parks next to them, they don't have trees in the street, they don't have nature reserves around them, and so on. You know, in 30 years of working with multicultural environmental participation, I can collapse the whole process into 2 phrases. We love what we enjoy and we protect what we love. So it's almost a privilege to love nature. The middle classes, they grow up with gardens, they go on the weekends with their children in the countryside and so on. A lot of this is just not available to people in such a way that they don't even know what wild nature is. And the Black Environment Network has really broken through with this, trying to get access for people to nature, and find that when they have access to nature, they do the same, because it's a human process. You protect what you love. So more of this, and better environments around the poorer areas and so on, not only increases benefits for the people living there, but it releases a vast missing contribution.
Yeah, and so I suppose you would say that this experience that we've all gone through recently is such a good opportunity to introduce people to nature, and to make the point that it's lovely if you can go into the countryside and do so safely, obviously, but even just within our cities, like the way that just round the corner from me, within 3 minutes of where I'm sitting now, there are acres of parkland in a very bog standard part of South London. If you want a bit of nature, you can go out and get it. And all these neighbourhood farms, you know, there's one again not far from me. There are opportunities, aren't there, Judy?
Yes, there are opportunities and opportunities, because in poorer areas, the opportunities are poorer in quality. And I can tell you that even on London transport, if you live on the east of London and you want to ever see Richmond Park, which is a national nature reserve, and it's like the countryside for a lot of people, to get to Zone 4 costs you £14. And the family on the east side of it will never see it.
Yeah.
These are the inequalities I think we've got to get into place, because we've got to get to the point where everybody has access, everybody protects nature because they love it.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's so important. And equally important, folks, we need your questions. It's getting pressing now. It's getting urgent. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes of this live panel. Look at these 3 amazing panelists you've got. They'll answer your questions. Make the most of them. So it's not too late. Put a question into the comments box over there on YouTube, and our moderators will pass it on to me. But it's got to be about the climate, COVID-19, COVID and climate change, the pandemic and the planet. We're going to talk about vaccines another time, but there's loads of questions you can come up with on this. And I'm literally right in front of me now, just below my camera. I'm looking out for your questions. Let's come back to you, though, Yuri, because as I sort of steer this towards the end game of this discussion, looking to the future and that big important thing that we all care about, the climate crisis, and how we're going to get to that, trying to get to that 1.5 degree target that in a weird kind of way, many people have forgotten about because we've been so worried about hand sanitizer and face masks and so on. But as all this blows through, we've got this pressing climate crisis. And I'm just interested, you know, when people are told that they need to act in a way that's going to hit this target of 1.5 degrees warming, that's just not enough, is it? Just telling people. This is a big discussion about who should be telling them, how they should be told, how they should be engaged.
Absolutely. And a big additional question is that climate change and limiting warming to 1.5 is a huge challenge. And of course, we translate that here in the UK in what we need to do locally. But it is obvious that we don't just care about keeping global warming to this kind of fictional number of 1.5. And why do I say this? That is because while trying to limit our emissions, we have to make lots of choices about how we want to do that. We can limit our emissions in very good ways, or we can limit our emissions in ways that increase inequalities or that even deplete biodiversity. For example, we could cut off all forest and just put bioenergy plantations there. This would drastically reduce our biodiversity and so on. It would absorb some carbon, but it would not be a really beneficial long-term and really desirable option. So I think now it's really also a good moment for people to think what they care about and how they can imagine ways of achieving it all together, both safeguarding biodiversity and nature while reducing emissions, but also keeping those aspects of society that make us human, keep a community, keep social networks, and keep ourselves connected.
Right. So, yeah, keeping it human, keeping ourselves connected. And I think we have seen during this crisis this drive towards connectivity. Look at all the people sitting here watching this and being part of this conversation tonight. You know, this has become a regular thing for us all now, sitting in on a Wednesday night on our laptops or our tablets, having a discussion like this. That's about connectivity. And yeah, of course, it was going on before this crisis, but we've necessarily seen so much more of it over the last 4 months because we haven't had many other choices. The theatres and cinemas are closed, or at least have been. But just whilst I'm talking to you about this, Yuri, I think maybe on the, for me anyway, less optimistic side is, as we all know, fixing climate change, addressing the climate crisis is about international action. And I'm going to put it to you that the response to this pandemic has been anything but international. It's been each country with its own rules about social distancing, about wearing face masks, with its own idea about track and trace and so on. I think it's hard to think of any reaction to any big crisis in the world that has been any less international than what we've seen. So if this is how we respond to a global pandemic, how on earth are we going to sort out the climate crisis?
That's a really good question. And indeed, the response has been very diverse and very different also in very different locations. And to be honest, I don't imagine the response to the climate change challenge to be any different. I do imagine every country to put in place measures that are most appropriate or most interesting to their local context. However, what hopefully, and there I'm a bit hopeful because I don't want to be here seen as the only person with that sees the future very dark. Is that this experience has also shown that just looking inside doesn't really work, and governments hopefully also see that. We see that now with we can't contain the virus in our borders if the virus is raging in other parts of the world. It's really hard, but we also understand that, and particularly in Europe, that we can't get out of this crisis, the economic crisis, without also supporting those countries that need it most. And that maybe those kind of insights can also be transplanted onto this other big challenge that we are facing.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Marina, let me come to you. A related question, really, not just about the international response, but the extent to which we're listening to the scientists. I just wonder, have we seen a rehabilitation of the expert, of the scientist? And if we have, does that bode well for listening to the experts who tell us how we're meant to be bringing down our carbon emissions?
Well, I'd like to think that we have. We definitely did in the beginning, but again, as I had mentioned before, it's about people need to trust the expert, right? So if they see the expert as the scientist, or if they see the expert as the government, or the WHO, they just need to have a relationship, and a relationship of trust with the expert. So I think we have so I think that's one of the reasons I'm hopeful that something positive could come out of this horrible pandemic. Just because we, it was really lovely to see models on TVs, and decisions being made on models, and people discussing models and playing around with like for me that was unreal, and I think that was wonderful.
Exactly. I mean, when you think in everyday parlance, people on the street just talk about flattening the curve. Who'd have thought that was going to be part of our vernacular at the beginning of the year, when things were so different? Related, and this is a great question from Robin Lamble. I think this is the question I wished I'd asked you, actually. This is why we want your questions, dear viewers. This is great. Listen to this. Robin says, do you see links between climate skepticism and COVID-19 skepticism? And if so, what lessons can we learn? And I think I'm going to put that to each of the three of you, because I think it's a great question. But whilst your mic is unmuted, what about this then? Do we tend to see the same kinds of people who are likely to be skeptical about the climate are the same ones who shrug their shoulders and dismiss this whole COVID-19 thing as a hoax?
Yeah, so absolutely. So you see the same sorts of arguments being done, the same sorts of confusion elements being used in communicating the I guess mistruths about the COVID crisis. So I think there's lots of similarities, and I think I guess in a way these behaviors now are nearly predictable, right? So if you really want to understand like whether these conspiracy theorists or if you want to identify these conspiracy theorists, you can actually, there's techniques to do so. So so it's the same.
Yeah, indeed. A few conspiracy theories turning up on YouTube, by the way. I'm having a good laugh looking at some of them, but then they're not going to get through to my panel here. But keep going, folks. It's fun. Right. What about you, Judy? We haven't heard from you for a while then. So what about this, the climate skepticism, and there's plenty of it about, and that must also relate to skepticism about the pandemic.
The pandemic is so serious. COVID is something that is very, very different as a virus and so on. It will hit those people who are skeptics. There will be more grief to come. Look at the people who went to holiday in Spain and the 10 people who came back with COVID. They are converts now as a series of COVID. So the reality will hit people and it will change behavior. If we keep going the way we're going, believe me, the virus will show you it is there. You don't need the news or anything, you will get it.
Okay, yeah. And Yuri, what about you? And I'll tell you what, just for you, I'm going to slightly rephrase the question just so that we can get this one in from Anusha, which is asking, does the pandemic mean our economies have to shift now towards more essential services such as food that would be sustainable during a crisis, and more away from the non-essential things like the luxury goods, because it's not so long ago all of us were panicking about where we were going to get our next meal. Seems like a while ago now, but it did remind us that those basic supply chains are a bit more important than getting our bling.
Yeah, starting with the question and the similarity with climate skepticism and COVID skepticism, I think there is, of course, a big similarity, and both other panelists have already shown or explained that the people and the tactics are the same. I mean, the big difference is, of course, that the consequences hit much quicker with COVID, and so those theories are much quicker corrected. With climate change, the danger is that it's really kind of a slowly creeping giant, and at the time when it's here, I mean, it is here, but at the time that it's really hitting us so hard that we wish we would have listened, it's really too late to avoid the worst. We can then we really need to we really don't have that option. I mean, as far as I can tell whether our economies have to focus on the essential. Well, I think economies always have to focus on the essentials first.
Yeah.
At the same time, at least from my point of view, even in this time of extreme disruption, I think that at least our food systems and our food supply has dealt quite well. Actually, the problems we faced were due to human misbehavior, kind of hoarding and just buying everything off the shelves in the shops, not because our systems of bringing food, even in full lockdown, were being stretched. So I think there is also a lesson to be learned there.
Yeah, so Marina, that's very important, really. It wasn't so much a failure of supply chains, but more of a failure of behaviour. Although you might argue, well, this was people who just completely understandably wanted to feed their families, may have had elderly relatives who also needed feeding. So you're putting a bit extra in your basket so you can take it round to Auntie Mildred. In many ways, people were behaving just, a survival instinct kicked in. And also about face masks, looking at some of the YouTube comments and questions just about the value of face masks. Now, my understanding is that you put on a face mask not because it will protect you from the virus, it's more to protect other people from you. And it's increasingly seen as being socially unacceptable not to be wearing a mask. So there you've got this interesting, I suppose, dance between good behaviour, but also communication. If people are going to behave well, they need to know why they're being asked, for instance, not to go shopping too much or to put on their face masks. So give us a behavioural perspective here, if you will.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. So I think people need information, right? And if they're not thinking about the shelves being restocked, they might not be thinking about not emptying the shelves, right? I guess people will always try to do what they think is best for them and for the people around them. So it's if you provide them with information that helps them change their behavior, they're not always going to change their behavior. There's things such as social norms which will also influence what a person will do and or not, but they help. And creating these social norms is what we would actually need to make sure that if we were going to make these behaviors continue into the future, we need to make them into social norms, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So, which brings us to the final closing comments. So I'm going to take a final comment from each of you. So, Marina, whilst you're speaking, let's put you on the spot first. Now, we started by asking how hopeful you are about this response and how it's going to affect our natural world and our stewardship of that world. So, in a way, we've asked you how optimistic you are. But I suppose, Marina, just what do you think should happen now? If you had the ear of, I don't know, the WHO or the UN or Boris Johnson, you've got the ear of hundreds of YouTube viewers now. And by the way, Yuri and Judy, I need answers from you on this. So you've got a bit more time than Marina to think about it. But what should happen next? Just in a few words, really briefly, if you can.
Well, so I think to the governments and WHO and all the NGOs should be thinking about two things. I think they should be thinking about equity and they should be thinking about sustainability. And I think equity, making the world a more equitable place is essential for sustainability. So I would be thinking about investing in things that will achieve these two objectives.
Okay, making it more equitable. You've already spoken a lot, Judy, about equality, so I know you're going to agree with that. So alongside all that, what do you want to see? Keep it nice and brief, if you will, Judy, but what do you hope is going to happen next? Hello, Judy, are you on mute? We can't hear you. Right, over to you, Yuri. What should happen next?
I'm on now.
Okay, well, the thing is Yuri is on, and then we'll finish with you, Judy. No worries. So stay on. Yuri, what should happen next?
Yeah, I think with really the mobilization of these huge amounts of money and stimulus that the government is putting in place, we really need to make sure that these are going in the right direction. And I think if we don't do so, I mean, this money might be we might be borrowing this money for the future, but not putting this towards sustainable future means we are currently borrowing societal welfare or well-being from the future. And that is also not a just or a good moral point to be.
Not where we want to be. Right, you've got 10 seconds, I'm afraid, Judy. So give me a Twitter length reply. What should happen next?
The media should concentrate on the stories that motivate people and make a difference. Look at what happened with the plastic stories and the photographs about suffering wildlife. We change everything about plastics. If we get the right stories in the news, people will take action.
Yeah, what a great example that is. Look at what we've done with plastics. Thank you so much. That's Judy, Ling, Wong. You've also heard folks from Marina Mills and Yuri Rogel. And that's been so nice to have all those panelists on. We want you to send us an evaluation. Tell us what you think. We've posted a link at the bottom of the YouTube event. It's underneath the bios. Fill in the evaluation. Tell us what we can do better next time. This has been recorded, so share the recording with your friends. So sorry if we didn't get around to answering your question, but come along to another one of these events, like the Poetry Slam that's happening in just about half an hour's time as well. Look at the website, the Be Inspired website, for details to that. You can also sign up to our events e-bulletin. Just search for it on Google, Imperial e-events, and you can find out about future lengths. Thanks so much to the team as well, Sam, Veronica, Abby, Holly, James, and others. Most of all, thank you to you, dear audience, for joining us for this discussion this evening. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you at the next one. I'm Gareth Mitchell, signing off and saying goodbye.